Okay, so my name is Kelly Dunley, and I'm one of the counselors here on staff. I've just been working with Head Start since the fall, and prior to that, I worked in a lot of different areas of focus regarding child abuse and neglect and children who were victims and things like that. So this is kind of a near and dear topic to my heart. So today we're talking about mandated reporting. Basically, if you work at Head Start, you're a mandated reporter because as in our Missouri law says, any daycare center worker or other child care worker, teachers, bus drivers, anybody working in the center automatically has a mandate to report any child abuse or neglect. So we'll start by just having some basic definitions of what abuse and neglect are. And so this is from the Missouri Child Welfare Manual. Any physical injury, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, they make an exception for spanking, and that's just kind of up to the discretion of the investigator who is investigating. And then neglect, failure to provide the basics that any child would need from whoever has care, custody, and control. So this is especially important for our Head Start population. Just some basic statistics. Almost half of kids who are abused or neglected are from the ages of 0 to 5, so the exact population that we serve at Head Start. 90% or higher live, like, or love the abuser or the person who's perpetrating on them. So often we'll say that home is still the most dangerous place for children to be. Approximately 80% of children who die from abuse are under the age of 4, and often if a partner is abusing their partner, if there's intimate partner violence happening in the home, then it's also going to extend to the children in some form or fashion. Missouri, that's the stats from 2016, 72,000 reports on 100,000 children in Missouri, and we continue in Southwest Missouri to be leading the state in or close to the top in the amounts that's reported. And so this is something that's really important for us because we're first-line people that are often interacting with these kiddos. So, like I said, Head Start kids are particularly vulnerable. A lot of them are just coming into centers, have never had outside mandated reporter interaction, and so with adults that are not a part of their family, they might never have been able to communicate something or been around a safe adult. They have very limited worldviews, and so it might be that no adults are safe to them yet. They're still learning about that stuff. They might have never been taught to report, or they might have been specifically told not to talk about things that happen in their home. We serve a population that tends to be at higher risk and more vulnerable because of the demographics, because of their social or economic standing in our communities. We serve a lot of single parents, and we'll kind of talk about how that's a very vulnerable population as well. So it's just this is just me painting the picture that this is really important for us to get right and to really take seriously and be aware of. Stop me if you have any questions, or I'll just talk the whole time. You're going to hear about how here at Head Start we're moving towards trauma-informed care, and so we're rolling that out more and more. 1 in 4 children before the age of 4 are experiencing some type of trauma. Many of them experience more than one trauma prior to the age of 4. Now, that's going to extend further out than child abuse and neglect because maybe it's a serious illness or their house caught on fire or something like that. But we know that child abuse and neglect definitely falls within that traumatic experience. And so this is something that at Head Start we're taking really importantly. We are moving from this kind of concept of what's wrong with you when we see kids acting out or different behaviors or families that are really struggling to what's happened to you. And we're framing our questions that way. What have been your previous life experiences that have caused you to behave this way or caused you to react or communicate to us this way? So when we're looking at child abuse and neglect, we're looking for some signs. Some kids are not going to have any signs. Some you're going to see a pattern. Sometimes they might have multiple signs, but anytime there's even one sign, it's an automatic cue for us to start taking things seriously and pay extra attention to what's going on with that kiddo. So we'll start by just talking about different types of abuse and then neglect and some indicators, behavioral and family kind of stuff that we can look for or be aware of. So we'll start with physical abuse. In your PowerPoint, you'll see how I've kind of outlined different injuries that we're going to pay special attention to. So injuries to thighs, calves, genitals, buttocks, cheeks, earlobes, lips, and neck. If we start seeing things, especially around the neck, that's super concerning, because anytime that there's choking involved with either a domestic violence situation or a child abuse situation, it automatically triggers everyone. There's a lot of research that shows that death becomes more imminent. Got that word right? And so we might want to pay more extra attention to those types of injuries. Obviously, kids from 0 to 5 get a lot of injuries. And so we're going to see hands scraped up or knees and bruises on the shins. Those are really typical of just kind of child play, learning how to walk, learning all of those kind of things. So that's why I kind of highlighted some other areas that are not as typical. Anytime we would see injury on a non-mobile child and our little babies in the early Head Start, that's automatically a huge red flag that needs to be outlined. Children consistently have bruises all over in various stages of healings. There's mismatching stories. So for instance, you have a kid that comes in and there's some cuts below the nose or right here, and mom says, oh yeah, he just slipped in the driveway and fell on the concrete. Well, if that were to make sense, then we would have scrapes on hands probably, or we might have something on the nose and on the chin, but not just some cuts, like right here, because that doesn't really make sense. It doesn't really add up. So anytime you hear kind of a mismatching story that you're like, that just doesn't really make sense to what mom said or whoever said, it's a red flag for you to be paying attention, make a hotline, do what you need to do. Again, injuries on children living in homes where we know or have some pretty strong suspicions that there's some domestic violence or maybe some substance abuse happening in the home, automatic red flags that just kind of jump out at us. And then injuries after a child has been absent for a period of time. Sometimes we'll have kids that are consistently gone on Mondays and Tuesdays and then are coming back. And that's always kind of one of those areas of what happened over the weekend, why are they not back yet? Behavioral indicators, often kiddos are going to communicate to us quicker through their behavior than their actual words, because we've got little kiddos that do not know how to communicate to us. They don't know sometimes that physical abuse is physical abuse and that adults shouldn't be doing that kind of stuff to them. So when we see a kiddo who's jumpy, or like you go up to kind of hug them and they just cringe, that's usually an indicator that something's likely happened to them in the past. Kids that are just having extreme aggression without a lot of provocation, a child won't share with them and they just kind of fly off the handle, or a teacher speaks to them in a stern voice and they just cannot handle that. Sometimes you'll see the opposite, where kids are not acting out, but they're so withdrawn. Kids that want to sit in the safe cube all day long, that won't interact, that won't play during center play, that don't go out on the recess and play outside and engage. Those are all definite red flags that something is happening at home or to them some other way that we need to be paying attention to. And then indicators in the family. Again, if there's conflicting stories, mom says, oh no, that happened when he was with dad about that black eye that you just asked them about, and dad says, I don't know how that happened, I never saw that before, and it's just not adding up, definitely a time where we would want to make a phone call. There's no explanation for the injury. Parents either aren't getting medical attention for injuries or are taking them to a lot of different doctors in order to avoid suspicions from doctors is something else. There's substance abuse in the home again, or there's just kind of that harsh discipline that doesn't seem to add up with the age or the offense by the child. So you see that parent who kind of overreacts, and it seems just over the top. Any questions about physical abuse? Okay. Sexual abuse. So the thing that I always want to hone in on for sexual abuse is that often we think that there has to be contact, and that's not true. So a lot of times when we're talking about sexual abuse, we would assume that an adult then somehow touched the child. And obviously that can be true and often is true, but it also includes things like showing a child pornography, talking to the child about sexual things, Voyeurism, which would be like, maybe there's two children involved and the adult is having the children act out on each other while that adult watches, or just the adult exposing themselves to the other child. So there is sexual abuse that happens without that touching component, is always the part I want to drive home. Stats really vary because sexual abuse is so underreported. There's estimates that only about 30% of victims ever come forward and talk about their sexual abuse. And so it's thought anywhere from 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys, maybe 1 in 10 kids. It's really hard to say still how many children are being sexually abused. This particularly is a pretty big deal in our area, just like the culture that has come down. And we'll talk about some other variables that make our population vulnerable. But there's something in the Ozarks where child sexual abuse has been happening for a long time. There's lots of generations that have lived through it. Less than 4% of proven cases have physical indicators. So this is always kind of a surprise to people. What that means is that there was a study done on several, I can't remember how many, but a lot of different cases on child sexual abuse where there was actual physical evidence in regards to like a picture or somebody walked in and saw it, so they knew it happened, but yet there was no physical findings. Only 4% of them had any kind of medical findings by a doctor after. And so we always want to make sure people understand that, because these cases are super hard to prove. I spoke with a detective. I used to be a forensic interviewer, and I was speaking with a detective that had moved from kid cases, these child abuse cases, to homicide cases. And he said, homicide cases are so much easier because you usually have some kind of a weapon. There's usually there's usually witnesses. There's all these other indicators and proof that they can find to corroborate but in child cases, it's the child's statement against an adult's statement. And often us, the community and the people who love the child, we don't want to believe or hear that this is really happening. So it's really somehow kind of easier for us to say, oh, that child just kind of got something in their head and, that can't be right. Again, the majority of child sexual abuse happens in the home. And so always something for us to be aware of. Risk factors for child sexual abuse. This first statistic actually even surprised me, and I've worked in this field for a really long time. But single parent homes or parents who have live-in partners are 20 times more likely, more at risk. That's not because single parents are bad parents at all. And so I always want to emphasize that. But a lot of the families that we serve are single parents. It's usually because single parents have a lot of stress and are trying to juggle a lot of balls at the same time. And so that friendly neighbor who just wants to get to know your child and offers to babysit while you run to the store, or while you have to go into work and your kiddo is sick and they can't call in, that becomes your only option, and you just need to trust that person. Well, groomers and abusers know that, and so they're targeting those kind of families in those situations so that they can't move in. Kids living in lower socioeconomic status are 3 times more likely, often for the same types of reasons, just because the family doesn't have as many protective resources that they can access. Children living in a rural community are 2 times as more likely. That's often due to a lack of education, a lack of resources for victims out there, and then just some cultural things that have been passed down for a long time. Females are at higher risk, minorities are at higher risk, and then children who witness or are victims of violent crimes tend to be at higher risk. So when we look at that, to me, I'm like, oh, that's just about every type of Head Start kiddo that we serve falls in one of those categories. So grooming, have you guys ever heard of the term grooming? Mm-hmm. Okay, shaking your head, yes. We're going to watch a little bit of a video just because it's only a 3-minute long one. I think it's a really good explanation of what grooming is, and then we'll talk about it a little bit further.
Grooming is the procedures that an offender would go through to make the intended victim more compliant, to get the individual, the child, to go along with it, or at least not protest, not run away, not fight, not resist. And so grooming is all those procedures to make the child pliable, so to speak.
I would just be friendly, play, I had him come over to have some some missing artwork. First it starts out that way.
And the grooming can be all sorts of things. The individual or the predator could start off by finding opportunities to spend time with the child that would be in excess of what you'd reasonably expect of someone who knew the mother only that period of time. Offer to do babysitting, offer to watch the kids while the mother runs an errand, offers to take the child to go do an activity. And at that point just gets friendly with the child, gets to know the child.
I was groomed as a child. My abusers they weren't strangers. They were people close to me. They were people that I trusted, people that my family liked, people that were important people in my life. They were close to me.
It starts very slow. People have an idea that if someone's sexually abused, they're grabbed off the street and stolen away, and it's physically violent. For most people like me, it's a very gradual process that the pedophile gets to know the child. Pedophiles are patient. They take their time. They develop a relationship. And, they earn the trust of the child. They earn the trust of the family.
I think that the perpetrator, when they start to groom a child, they want to see how far that they can take it and then they will slowly progress into doing different things and seeing how far they can go and seeing if the child will disclose or tell. The pedophile or the predator will trap the child by making you were smoking, you were drinking. You saw this a lot with the Boy Scouts. So then it's, if you tell, I'll tell them you were smoking dope, and they're going to see it if I test you for drugs. So it's, how can I trap these children in any way, shape, or form that I can? And it's a constant path of lies and deceit that starts so innocently that children can't pick it up. And that's why they fall victim so quickly to a pedophile.
Any reactions or thoughts about that? Is anything surprising?
I think one thing that we always try to work on with teaching children about stranger danger, they sometimes felt that it was a person that would look scary to them rather than someone they trusted.
Right.
And so
Right.
it's kind of difficult to teach children, to think about how they feel around that person rather than, because it may be somebody they trust and have, befriended or has befriended them.
And one of the things that we teach, and we teach in Head Start, and it's not a bad thing to be teaching, but that the grown-ups are the authority. They're in charge. They're the boss. And so teaching kids to not have to listen to a grown-up who's telling you to do some touching or showing you things, that gets really confusing for kids. And it often, and the thing is that predators know that because they're just so savvy and trying to play off of children's vulnerabilities, families' vulnerabilities. So we look at this, they'll specifically target families that are passive, quiet, trusting, troubled, or lonely because they need the help. They have vulnerable spots. The kids can't be trusted anyways because these are troubled kids that, don't believe anything that they say. And then we have children that as a result of their sexual abuse or other types of abuse begin acting out in certain ways. And so it becomes this catch-22 for these kids that are stuck in these cycles. But groomers are very, very good at what they do. And they don't just groom the kids, they groom the whole family, the whole community sometimes. And that's why communities tend to be shocked when, it's a pastor that all of a sudden is discovered, or a coach, or Boy Scouts like they talked about, because you thought they were the safe people. But no kids are ever prepared or ready or know how to, and nor should they have to handle abuse. And so that's why it's our job to be really knowledgeable and understand dynamics or just some red flags and signs that we see so that we can work to protect them. So, of course, while kids are growing, there's going to be some healthy sexual development type stuff going on. And I don't want everyone to freak out when we see kids that are pretending to be dating or married as they play in their centers. They're going to talk about their bodies. They're just discovering all the differences between boys and girls and how does that work. And so they might ask questions or be curious. And that's totally normal and healthy and not bad. But what we want to be aware of is when kids are very fixated on it and they're difficult to redirect, or they have unusual or sophisticated knowledge about how the body works or things that are happening. And so they're using those words that just kind of almost make you cringe because you're like, how does a 4-year-old know that? Those are red flags that should be going off to us because if they haven't experienced it themselves and they've been seeing something or they've heard something, which means they're being exposed to things, and sometimes that's a process of grooming. If they can mimic actual movements, that's another huge red flag because they've at least at minimum seen it, if not experienced it. Again, the excessive masturbation, despite being redirected, red flag. If we've got some regression happening, that's a red flag. A lot of aggression or withdrawal, again, those are all red flags that we need to be aware of for childhood sexual abuse. Specifically with sexual abuse, children that we're working with have been groomed. So one common one that we would see a lot is perpetrators offending during bath time, because that's a hard time for children to know what's wrong and what's right. You know, it's just so-and-so gave me a bath, and so that's how they wash me. And there's other things happening during the bath time. Kids don't know. Sometimes it's a tickle game is another one that we would uncover. So kids that we're working with often have never been taught, because that still tends to be taboo amongst families to really talk about sex, especially that young age, and about different areas of our body and use proper terminology. And so it's really up to us to be watching for some of these signs to be able to understand maybe if there's more going on. Family indicators. Now, of course, I never want to put these out there saying, you know, if somebody has marital problems and there's probably child sexual abuse happening in the home. I mean, that's a little bit dramatic. But I think specifically if we know there's been a history of sexual abuse in the family, if maybe one of the parents have been a victim, or if maybe they've been accused or been a perpetrator in the past. If we look at how close they are, there's just some families that don't want to let you into their house. They don't want to do home visits in the home. They don't want to tell you about who's living in the house or anything. That's kind of a red flag that there might be something more going on there. Overcrowding in the home is something that we see a lot with our families that we serve. And so just learning about sleeping arrangements, because that's when kids are put more at risk when they're sharing beds with adults, or there's people in and out of the house that aren't part of the family that are just, it's a really transient kind of life. Kids are at higher risk. So again, just stuff to be aware of. Emotional abuse is a really difficult one for anyone to ever prove or really move forward in an investigation on its own. But it's always good information to include if you have to hotline something. And so there's a brief definition: injury to the child's physiological capacity. I think I'm supposed to say psychological capacity. I might have typed that in wrong. Or emotional stability. But when we just see the parent really badgering the child, calling them really horrible names, if they do that in front of us, we can only imagine what they're doing in private when there isn't other people around. Or it's just that complete lack of attachment or any interaction with their child. When they're closed off and locked in their bedroom and kiddos just kind of fending for themselves, that can be another type of an emotional abuse. Neglect. So we've got physical, medical, and educational. We'll talk about physical in a second. Medical neglect is kind of what it sounds. I mean, there's a medical need and the parent isn't filling it, isn't treating the child. So, you know, we might see that in our centers, like a child's diagnosed with diabetes, but the parents aren't really following the food schedule or getting the insulin that the child needs, and you can tell a difference in the child's physical health because of it. That would be a type of medical neglect we might see in the classroom. Educational neglect doesn't really apply to us because by law they don't have to be attending school or homeschooled until a certain age in Missouri. So those are typically something that happens a little bit later. But physical neglect is what we would see mostly in our classrooms. And that goes back to, remember I said that the person has to have care, custody, and control. So it's not like, if uncle's in the house while mom and dad are in the house, but uncle refuses to get them some food. It would be pretty difficult to determine whether uncle had care, custody, and control. I mean, those are some of kind of the differences. But if parents aren't providing, or whoever the caregiver isn't providing food, if the child's coming just filthy, if there's scabies or lice that's not being taken care of in a timely manner, if the child's not getting sleep and the parent's not providing any supervision or just generally not providing supervision, those are all kind of indicators that I've seen so far just this year of I think that there might be some neglect happening in the home. We also might see some hoarding of food. That's another one we see pretty commonly. You'll have, I won't say commonly, but I have seen in the classroom those kids that just come in and eat their lunch as fast as they can as if they have never eaten before, and they will clear the table. Then that kind of leads us to believe like maybe there's some food insecurity at home and they're not getting as much food as they need. So family indicators. Again, we go back to single parent families. Maybe there's some high stress, if there's some substance abuse in the home, and parents are struggling with their own mental illness or other emotional issues happening, just insufficient financial funds. I mean, maybe the family's just really, really hard up for money, for a place to live, for those types of things. Maybe mom and dad are a little bit lower functioning and they don't understand the proper way to care for their child, or proper hygiene or proper sleep schedules or things like that. This can be a really difficult one for us because we are coming alongside families trying to help them out of tough situations. And so that line can get really blurry of where do we just need to offer more support versus when is it time to call someone. And obviously I think you're just working with people to make those determinations because it will be different. But we always want to err on the side of the child, because if we're just kind of struggling watching the child, imagine what this child is living through. And calling Children's Division or making these hotlines isn't, often we think of it as just this horrible negative thing in a family's life. But when we get to things like neglect, Children's Division has so many resources that they can offer families and walk alongside families, getting them connected in the community for things like housing or support in the home or substance abuse treatment or whatever it is that family is really struggling with. And so if we can look at it more as a resource to these families, that can sometimes help us know how to move forward with these situations. I just included this slide not because it super applies to our population, because we're working with 0 to 5, but this is such a huge deal just in general with kids. And once you're a mandated reporter for kids, you're a mandated reporter for all kids. And so there might be other kids that you interact with somewhere that are accessing technology on a regular basis. 1 in 5 kids solicited sexually online. I mean, those are huge stats, and most kids aren't reporting because they don't want their technology to be taken away. So this is just a place that you can call, the Cyber Tip Hotline. It's a federally funded thing. Children with disabilities, this is another just kind of random one that I wanted to put in there because we do work with quite a few kids that have some disabilities, whether it is a physical disability or a developmental delay or emotional disturbances, and they're automatically at higher risk for any type of child abuse and neglect. There's often a lack of knowledge or misunderstanding. They're often not given the same information that your average functioning kids have access to, and they're so dependent on their caregivers or other adults in their lives for everything. And so I just always throw that in there because I want people, if they have somebody in their classroom that has a disability, that's just kind of at the back of your mind. So reasons that kids don't tell. A lot of times kids will say, well, nobody asked me, because they don't know. Or sometimes it's just because they didn't know they were supposed to tell. We expect, as a general rule in our country. We expect kids just to tell right away and keep themselves safe. And we don't say that, but that's a lot of times how our actions are our responses to children. Why didn't you tell anybody? Well, why didn't you just leave? Well, why didn't you tell that person to stop? And so we want these little guys to have adult responses to these really horrible situations. But this is something that when I go to court I testify in a lot, is about different blocks that kids have to telling. And so there's three main ones. Motivational tends to do with relationships, the relationship with yourself. Maybe there's fear, shame, embarrassment, a sense of responsibility, the relationship you have with the perpetrator. Maybe it's somebody you love, because just because dad's doing something to you, you still love dad. You still want to go play video games or go to McDonald's with dad. You just don't want him to do the abusive things that he's doing. Maybe it's out of fear because you're trying to protect your family, because whoever's hurting you said, if you tell anyone, I'll hurt your family, or I'll hurt your sister, I'll do this to your brother if I can't do it to you. So there's that sense of responsibility that kind of blocks. Motivational blocks can also include culture. Maybe just in your family culture, you don't talk to people about what's happening in your home, or religion, if it's something that's happening in a church, and so you don't feel like you can speak against the pastor or whoever. So there's a lot of different variables for motivational blocks. Developmental blocks is a huge one for the kids that we serve, because they're so little, their brain can't hold all those details of abuse. They haven't learned that this is abuse, that it's not okay, because every adult they know have done these kinds of things to them, or whatever it is. So this is where they're still learning what's okay and what's healthy and what's safe versus what's not, because what they may have been experiencing up until now has been their normal. Developmental blocks can also include just that lack of ability to communicate. They may not have the words to say or know how to say it because they don't really understand what's happened to them. Or it can be addressing developmental delays or attention span or things like that. Institutional blocks has to do with institutions. So maybe there's been some huge systemic failures in their life. Maybe they've already been in foster care and they just got back home, so they don't want to say something because they're scared that they'll get taken out of the home again. Or maybe every time they've seen a police officer, it's been in a really bad, scary situation, and so police are scary to them. They're not safe people. Sometimes it's just the family has a general distrust for any authority. And so anybody who's perceived as authority in their lives, they feel afraid of, because that's been the culture of their family. So when a child does tell, no pressure, but they tend to try to tell just one time. And so if a child were to ever tell you or me, it's really important the way that we respond, because the adult's response to the disclosure will directly impact the way the child moves forward in their process. And I like to tell everyone that disclosure is a process. It's not a one-time event. And so another common thing that I'm testifying about in court is the process of disclosure. It's kind of similar to maybe the stages of grieving, where everyone kind of hits on generally in these stages but won't experience them the same way. But I say this for you guys because there's a few things that I always want to highlight for mandated reporters. It's normal for kids to deny what's happened to them if they're not ready to talk about it, or they don't know how to handle it and they don't know what to do. It's completely normal for them to say, that's never happened to me. And it's also completely normal for them to take it back and say, I made that up. That's not really true. Because it can be scary. It's hard for it's hard for adults to talk about when something's happened to them. So it's really hard for kids to talk about. Or maybe when they told dad had to leave the house, or mom started crying, or some other kinds of things happened that they're like, I don't want to do that anymore, and so I'm just going to take it back. Those are the things I always want to point out to people. So when to report? If you have a suspicion, the way our law reads is just the suspicion of abuse. So we do not have to have conclusive proof. You have that gut feeling that something's not right, you can call. When you've discovered, so maybe you've seen something happen, maybe mom came in to check kiddo into the classroom and you see that mom left the baby outside in the car by itself while mom came into the center. Or there's been a disclosure. A child actually tells you that something has happened. There's a couple of different types of disclosure, accidental and purposeful. Typically, what we'll probably see a lot in Head Start are accidental disclosures, because that just means the child doesn't really know what they're disclosing. They're sitting at carpet time and you guys are talking about keeping your body clean and brushing your hair and brushing your teeth, and she says, oh yeah, my Uncle Timmy washes me like this, and does a demonstration. She has no idea. She just disclosed something to you and everyone else is like, ah. So you might get disclosures. So when you're thinking about should you or should you not make a report, I generally will say if you have to ask yourself that question, then you probably need to make the report. But it can be really uncomfortable or scary, especially if you've never been used to making reports, because we have a lot of self-doubt. I mean, I've made hundreds of reports, and I still often will stop myself and be like, am I just making this up in my head? Kind of second guess some of the things that I already know is true. So it does require us to take a risk, but you don't have to have proof, and it is our individual mandate, which means if you're at your center, a lead teacher can't impede you, they can't stop you, the center director can't, our director can't stop us. Legally, you have the right to make that phone call as soon as, safely possible to report it. Our mandate applies to all children, and we err on the side of the child in all cases. So that meaning, if you see something and parent tries to explain it away or somebody else tries to explain it away, we're going to give the benefit of the doubt to the kid, not to the parent, because who has more reason to make something up? It's usually the parent or the adult in the situation. So if a child were to disclose to you, which this is likely not to happen too often in Head Start just simply because of their age, but if they were to come in and say something about not being safe at home, or they have a black eye and you ask what happened to their eye and they begin to report, you try to find a private place, let the child choose who they want to talk to. You can sit next to them. You want to make them feel as safe and comfortable as possible. So you're going to use the child's words. That becomes really important when we hotline it, because we don't want to all of a sudden, for our little girl sitting on the carpet that said, Uncle Timmy did this to me to wash me, we're not going to start calling that sexual abuse, because we don't really know if that was sexual abuse. We're just going to say, the child said, Uncle Timmy did this to me, and give them as closely to the child's words as possible. And same when you're talking with the child, using their words, not using the big grown-up words. Reassuring the child that it's okay to tell, and promising them that they're not in trouble with you. So because as adults, we often want to promise the world to this poor child and we can't promise the world. I've had kids sit and disclose and make really great statements, and then for whatever reason in the case have to go back home. So never promising that they're not going to see that person again or they'll never get hurt again. We have no control over those things. And it's really important to maintain that trust and be as honest as possible with the kids. And then hotline immediately as is safe for that child and for you and for your center. And I put remember your role. I think it's always important for us to stay in our lanes. We're not investigators. We're not forensic interviewers. We have no standing in that. And so once that child makes the disclosure, then we back off and we let professionals do their job and what they need to do to move forward in that case. So this is just a short video on how to respond to a child.
Talk to me so I can understand you. Remember, I am a kid, and I don't always understand grown-up words. Never promise me you will keep what I tell you a secret. Don't tell people who don't need to know. I need to trust you. You need to understand that it might be hard for me to talk about the abuse. Someone might have told me not to tell, or threatened to hurt me, or my family if I do tell. I might feel embarrassed or think what happened was my fault. Make sure to tell me that you still care about me. Reassure me that what might be testing you to see if I can trust you. I may have tried to tell others, but changed my mind. Don't act shocked about what I say. It could make me feel bad. Tell me that it took a lot of courage to tell what happened, and it was the right thing to do. If you are sad, tell me that it is because you care about me and don't want to see me hurt. Tell me you will be okay. I worry about you too. Tell me what is going to happen next. Don't ignore me just because I'm a kid. If I have questions, don't make up answers. Tell me that you don't know, but you will try to find out. It's okay not to always know the answer. I chose to tell you my biggest secret. I am trusting you to help me.
So I like that video because, it's obviously from a little bit older child's perspective, but I think it gives some good feedback on our response and our reaction to the child. And so if we have a kid that comes and says something to us and we're like, or we start crying, or we start having this big emotional, big feelings, reactions, children often will shut way down. And so it's a huge reminder to us to just, as best as we can in that moment, neutral face and moving forward and being the adult that child needs at that time. So what not to do when a child discloses: continue to investigate or interrogate the child about what happens. Please, please, please do not ask the child to tell somebody else about what's happened. So, if you're out on the playground and the child says something to you and then you're like, oh, wait, come here and let's go tell the head teacher this, or go tell the family advocate what you just told me. Or, we see that a lot in public schools still sometimes, where a kid comes and tells the teacher says, go talk to the counselor, and the counselor says, hold on, I got to get the principal, and the principal comes in and asks. And we want to avoid doing that as much as possible for the child. Don't ever speak negatively about whoever the child has just spoken about, because more often than not, that child has a very close relationship with that person and loves that person dearly still. And so that can create a huge block for the child. Again, not making promises you can't keep, not talking about it in the center. Now in your position, or whatever position, really, there's probably going to be one or two people that you're going to pull in, maybe a lead teacher or a center director or a counselor or whoever, to kind of support, or the supervisor to support you in that hotline process. But just chit-chatting about it with all the other teachers or the kitchen staff or the bus drivers or whatever it is, because this is really private information for children and for families, and we want to always respect and give dignity to those people. Don't ever question the validity of the child's disclosure just because it is not up to us. And again, it shuts a child down so quickly. So I don't care if the child says it was the man on the moon that punched them in the face, we're going to hotline it. I literally have hotlined kids who disclosed on Elmo and different things, because we don't know if Elmo's a street name to somebody. We don't know if that's just a nickname for somebody, or if that child's just, that's another thing that they can think of. But that's for the professionals, again, to figure out. We still make those hotlines, and we make them as soon as possible. And then don't ever give the family a heads up. That can be hard for us, too, because we have relationships with the families. But when we do that, we are literally impeding investigations, sometimes criminal investigations, depending on what the disclosure is. And so we need to just hotline it as soon as possible and keep that kiddo safe, and let them move forward in the way that they need to. So how to report. Missouri has a hotline 24/7, 365 days a year. So our first option is to call the hotline. There's also an online way we can do it for kind of lower offenses, yeah, I believe they'll take it for neglect, or if it's been a significant amount of time passed. But if it's ever sexual abuse or there's a current injury on the child, we have to call it in. We can't use the online reporting. And then, of course, if it's super emergency and you don't feel like the hotline is enough and you need to call 911 because there's an immediate risk to a child or to the center or whatever is happening, then we call 911 as well. But that doesn't supersede our need to hotline. So if you have to call law enforcement, we still have to hotline. So the hotline's response, their whole responsibility or their purpose is to be able to determine if how the age of the child, who this child is, the impact of the abuse, who had care, custody, and control, if this meets the statutes or the definitions, the legal definitions for child abuse and neglect. Those are all the kinds of things that they have in their head trying to figure out as they ask you questions. They're going to ask you 1,000,001 questions that you can't answer, and that's okay. So before you call the hotline, there is a paper in the centers that you'll fill out with all the child's information. It will have the birth date and the address and the phone number and what the child said, all of those kinds of things. Getting that ready is really important because that will help prepare you to make that actual phone call to the hotline. And you can work with your center director, your lead teacher, whoever, to get that paper and to get the information filled out on there that you have. Because before you call the hotline, you want to know as much about that child as you possibly can. Not necessarily as much about their abuse or their disclosure, because we're not investigating that, but as much about the child, who lives in their house, their birth date, mom's cell phone number, where does dad work, whatever it is that you can find out about that family before you make the hotline. When you call the hotline, you're going to identify yourself as a mandated reporter, and then they'll ask for your name and where you work and those types of information. Then they're going to ask the name of the child that you're concerned about. They'll ask for all the family or all the members of the household, any other children that are living there. They'll ask for approximate ages or birth dates of the family members in the household. They'll ask for the address of the household, all the phone numbers you have. They ask for everything so that their workers can find this family and make sure they have the right family and all of that kind of stuff. They'll ask about the perpetrator, what information you have about that person, and then they'll ask what type of abuse it is. Is it physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, drugs, all of that. And you'll make whatever categorical statement that you feel like it fits in. And then they'll just ask you what happens. And that's your time to give as much detail about the specific incident. So we were sitting at carpet time with the entire class talking about bathing, hand washing, and brushing teeth. Little Susie raised her hand and said, "Uncle Timmy washes me like this." And that was it. And you describe she took her hand and she made this movement in this area of her body. I mean, we get as detailed as possible because that helps them be able to determine, how to categorize this and have a clearer picture of what's really going on. And then when it's assigned to an investigator, if it is, then the investigator will actually know a good picture of what happened. So we want to be really good reporters in that way. Sometimes it'll be things like, I kind of go into this in the next slide, but we will talk about, they have a really chaotic lifestyle. If we can define what we mean by that to the hotline, so instead of, because I'm very guilty of saying the chaotic lifestyle thing, which is what made me think of it and put it up there. If we can define, that means, they've moved 5 times this month and mom's phone number is always changing. I've got 3 new phone numbers from her in the last 2 weeks. And there's people that seem to be in and out of their house. We can paint that picture a little bit better of what we mean when we say chaotic lifestyle. That gives the hotline somewhere to go with that information. Or he's always just showing up with marks and bruises versus then, he came to school and he had a cut above his left eye and there was a light bruise on top of his cheek on the right side. And then there was, where we're getting very specific about the injuries that we see, about times and dates if we can at all possible, about absences and all of that type of information instead of just kind of throwing out these really general type statements. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And after you tell them about the specific event that happened that caused you to make that hotline, you can tell them anything that you want to about what your gut feeling is. We're really worried that mom's using, or the kiddos' behaviors just really changed in the classroom. They used to be really outgoing and compliant and not have any issues. And this week they've just been melting down all the time, and maybe they've gotten written up for some things, or there's been more aggression, where you can talk about that stuff. Because again, we just have to have the suspicion of. We do not have to have conclusive facts about what has or has not happened. And so all of that can paint a picture to help communicate to that hotline worker that I'm really concerned about this child, because there's a lot of things that are just kind of not adding up for what's going on with this kiddo's life. It's also really important that if you don't know the answer, that you say unknown as opposed to no. Because sometimes what we hear often is like they'll ask you, is there any drugs or violence or weapons in the home? And we're just like, no, I'm sure it's fine. But we don't really know that, right? And so that can put other people at risk when they're going out to visit the home. So in those types of scenarios, just unknown. Is mom using right now? Unknown. Do they have enough food in the house? Unknown. Because we're not there to see it. So don't just kind of guess, I guess is what I'm saying. It's okay to say unknown. The hotline will ask you more questions than you would ever have the answer to, and that's okay. That's their job, because they're just trying to make the best decision that they can. If you're not satisfied with the response that you've gotten from the hotline, you can ask to speak with a supervisor. You can call back to talk with another hotline worker. There is sometimes a lot of turnover at the hotline, or sometimes people we don't communicate well with each other. Like, I just feel like you're not understanding what I'm saying. I'm not really getting where you're coming from. Call back and try again if you feel like it. If you feel like it really needs to be handled in a different way, you can call your local children's division office. You can call law enforcement. So you don't have to walk away saying like, oh, they just didn't get it. I'm so frustrated. We have other options. So children's division's going to put it in one of these categories. Goes all the way up from investigation. So this is like serious physical abuse, sexual abuse, things like that. Assessment, you might have some more mild, moderate physical abuse, some neglect kind of things going on. Referrals can be non-caretaker. So, we kind of talked about before how care, custody, and control. Well, just because Uncle Bobby didn't have care, custody, and control of Susie while they were at grandparents visiting for Christmas doesn't mean he's not going to be investigated. And so that goes under a referral. Juvenile report, if it's two kids that are doing stuff, those are handled a little bit differently, because it's handled from a very, basically where both juveniles are looked at as victims, but we just need to get to the bottom of where did this start from. And then documenting calls, it doesn't really rise to the level of child abuse and neglect right now. It still serves a purpose. And right here, when they call things, I hear a lot of people frustrated and, well, what's it matter and why am I even bothering? But those serve a purpose too. When I was doing interview, I would ask for all of the call history on a child, and it can start to establish a timeline where Susie's like, I told somebody about this last summer, but she didn't know how to say it or what to say so that it could accurately describe what's happening to her. So the mandated reporter just called in what they had, which didn't rise to the level, so they called it, but they can see, oh yeah, Susie did talk about this happening then. Kind of establishes that timeline. There's enough calls that come in on a certain victim child, supervisors can pull that and look at it to see if it really does need to be elevated to a different level. So they do serve a very important purpose. Then there's different investigation time frames. Level 1 is your most serious. They're going to try to make contact with that victim child within 3 hours. And so that means if you're at a center and you've called on something, that they might be coming out to the center to talk to that child right away. And that's just something that's important for everyone to know and be made aware of, whether it's your center director or lead teacher, to be expecting, and probably call your area supervisor and get everybody kind of just so that everyone's aware that this is happening right now. And then that goes all the way down to level 3, where they might not contact anyone for 24 hours. These are different rulings on investigation. So preponderance of the evidence means that basically we found 51% threshold that yes, this could have happened. This happened to this child. Children, I was never an investigator, so I don't understand completely how it all works and they come to their determinations. But one thing I do know for certain is an unsubstantiated report, which is sometimes you'll get a letter back saying, you called in this, it was taken as an investigation. It was unsubstantiated, meaning we couldn't find enough evidence or we don't have anything to support that this actually happened. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means that they couldn't meet their threshold to say that this happened. And so I have cases still that I go to court on that were unsubstantiated by Children's Division, but because the law is written so different for Children's Division and law enforcement moved forward with charges, and the prosecutor is filing them. And so I'm going to court on criminal proceedings or cases that are unsubstantiated. So anytime I hear somebody say, well, I called it in, but it was unsubbed, so it didn't happen, it's like one of my pet peeves. Be like, that's not true. And I usually call people on it because I think that's a very dangerous mentality for us to get in. Failure to report, there's all these things that can happen to us. We can get fined, we can go to jail, we can have this misdemeanor filed against us, but the most important thing is that we're just putting kids at risk. And so what to do after? You continue to be that safe, supportive person. You know, like I've said, it's a hairy boundary for us with the families that we're walking alongside and working with. But to the best of our ability, maintaining that professional, non-judgmental type attitude towards that child and family, continuing to be awesome teachers, awesome bus drivers, awesome nutritionists, just to provide the best support that we can to that child and that family with everything that they may or may not be going through at this time. Backing off and letting professionals do what they need to do in order to investigate. We don't need to ask any more questions of the child. We don't need to ask the parents any more questions. You know, that's all for the professionals to do. But if something does come up, if a parent discloses something, if a child says something more new information or discloses a different event, we start that process all over again and hotline it again. Most importantly, I always want to tell people too to take care of themselves because this can feel really stressful and it can trigger things in our own lives, especially if we've had personal experiences or we know somebody close to us that have gone through some of these things. And so while we always want to maintain confidentiality of the child and the specifics of that, of what's happened, it's more than okay to talk about, man, I had to make a hotline call and I'm feeling really stressed out about it. I'm feeling really sad for that kid. I'm feeling really angry at the person who did this to the kid or whatever it is, and to kind of talk to your support people. There's always people at central office. The counselors absolutely are always there to talk and process through and offer support in whatever way we can. So really supporting each other through this process, encouraging each other, and helping each other out with it. Any questions? Did I give you more than you ever wanted to know about child abuse and neglect and mandated reporting? Those are some general just resources if you're just curious for your own personal benefit, and where I got some of the statistics. Some of them just have some really good information in personal lives and our professional lives that we can use on this topic. So that's it.